Everybody, welcome to another chat in the fishing industry conversations. Of course, I'm super excited to have tonight's conversation. I think it's a very good topic to discuss where we are with the FRAP 2020 process. Just by way of introduction, my name is Miles and I'll be the host. Of course, I'm chatting to Dr. Thando Vilakazi. So Dr. Thando Vilakazi, I've got his CV here, but I'll probably keep you busy for the next half an hour, so I try to summarize it. He's the Executive Director of the Center of Competition Regulation and Economic Development at the University of Johannesburg. He also currently serves as a part-time member of the Competition Tribunal of South Africa, and he also led research and teaching advisory projects across various economic sectors. And he's also the co-editor and co-author of a recent HSRC press book titled Opening the South African Economy, Barriers to Entry and Competition. So Dr. Thando Vilakazi recently published or co-authored a paper called The Political Economy of Competition, Regulation and Transformation. Of course, it's a long title, but it's basically just BEE in the fishing industry. It's titled BBBEE and Quota Allocations in South African Industrial Fisheries. So, yeah, but just by a quick summary, it's a paper on BEE, how it impacts quota allocations in South Africa. And it was the research was done on the deep sea sector. So just a quick introduction. So South Africa has got 22 sectors. 12 of those sectors are up for renewal in the FRAP process, and the deep sea trawl is one of them. We're just going to find out by Dr. Vilakazi, why did they pick the deep sea? And and what about, and just these findings and just the overview of the study. So Dr. Thando Vilakazi, good evening and welcome. I've never had such a long introduction for someone ever.
It was a lot. Good evening, Miles. It's really great to be here. I think this is a fascinating topic. Hopefully I can be useful for these discussions.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think where we are now, just to give some background, the FRAP 2020 process in terms of the gazetted timelines commences today, the 12th of October. And during this period, the 12 policies will, of course, the draft policies will be released. And those draft policies will be released for public comment from stakeholders in the fishing industry. And once that closes, then we're moving into 2021, where we'll see the rights allocation process applications commence. So Dr. Thando Vilakazi, for those that have been living under a rock in the fishing industry, tell us a bit about who Dr. Thando Vilakazi is, quickly.
I think those that are in the fishing industry would not maybe have come across our work. So, we're a team of economists based at UJ in the center, as you've mentioned, Center for Competition, Regulation and Economic Development. And really at the heart of a lot of the work we do is trying to understand this question of barriers to entry, this question of how do you broaden economic empowerment and economic participation in the South African economy in particular. And how do you have a more competitive and dynamic economy as well? I think it's well written, it's stated in the NDP and a range of other policy documents. You still have a very concentrated economy. And there's a lot of pressure, I think, from different stakeholders in the society to broaden participation and ownership. I really, by way of introduction of myself, do a lot of my work on those types of issues. So barriers to entry, BEE, and a lot of sector-specific studies as well. We then came upon this study because I think this is just a fascinating sector to look at. But it's also very good timing, as you've said, because I think obviously the FRAP process is a hot topic right now, and our hope was then to try and hopefully contribute to these debates about what the future of the sector look like. But also by learning from the Hague deep sea trawl sector, we can also maybe make some inferences about what transformation in other economic sectors should look like in the BEE policy as a whole. So by way of introduction, that's kind of the work that I do, focused largely on competition and barriers to entry issues.
Okay, perfect. So, of course, I read the paper, fascinating paper, love the research, also learned a few things. And I just wanted to start off, how did you come across the fishing industry? And why did you decide, of all the sectors of South Africa, why are we looking at the fishing industry?
Sure. There's actually a very nice pragmatic explanation for how we got here, which is that my co-author, who's Professor Stephano Ponte, based at the Copenhagen Business School, did some work in the 2000s, around 2007, with a number of other co-authors looking at precisely the hake deep sea trawl sector and what at the time was a very live process of the allocation of long-term fishing rights. And so in many ways, this was an opportunity to revisit that same sector and see, well, how far have we come? Have we made the progress that was desired at the time? And what needs to happen going forward in the current FRAP process? I think that this particular subsector of South African fishing industry is still useful. So I think there's an argument about whether we shouldn't have looked at a range of other sectors as well. But I think this one is particularly important because, I mean, it does account for something like 45% of the value of kind of South African fishing activities overall, right? So there's real significance and potential for lessons that will cut across the board, even from just looking at this one subsector. In which there have been substantial changes in terms of the allocation of rights. And so I think it's from that standpoint, if you will, that we've come into this. It's also a sector, maybe from a kind of, I suppose, more boring academic perspective, where we were excited by the fact that you have this very nice intersection between a range of different issues. So it's not just about BEE in the sector. It's not just about fishing policy in the sector. Actually, there's very important factors to do with competition economics or competition policy. There's much broader kind of economic development and socioeconomic rights issues that are at play in the sector. And so we thought it was a really great place to kind of locate ourselves and see if we can at least contribute in some way to the discussions.
Okay, perfect. So just by way of overview, so you get into the fishing industry, you, of course, have to pick your actors and your role players of the people you're going to discuss. I see in your paper also you had several interviews from various people, of course, all anonymous parties. But just for the viewer, can you just give us an overview of who did you chat to, which areas of the fishing industry you chat to? How was the reception when you came to explain what we want to do? Or were there some people that said, okay, I'm not really interested in having this conversation? And I mean, how was your engagement with them? Did you feel like, okay, this is something really the fishing industry wants?
Sure. Hey, I think it was actually quite a surprising set of engagements. So I think it's important to emphasize that there's a very interesting cross-cutting theme across all the people we spoke to or tried to speak to, which is this general interest in seeing that the sector continues to grow and that it continues to transform in terms of racial transformation of ownership and participation in the sector. Now, of course, there's debates about what that looks like, and you might think transformation looks like X, and I might think it looks like Y. But the point is there are some common themes that emerged, which I think is an important place to start our discussion. And so in going about the research, we tried to be as representative as you can be, but this was not a kind of mass industry survey, because I think that's hardly the point. What we focused on was doing detailed, semi-structured, deep dive interviews with different players that are located at different places through the value chain, but also other stakeholders, including government, including people that have had association with government over time, including industry bodies or representatives, including large companies, including some of your Black-owned SMMEs, including some of your not Black-owned SMMEs, firms operating and processing in that as well. Because we kind of came into it to say, you can't come in and kind of pronounce in terms of policy in the sector without what I think should be a very holistic view of a very complex economic sector, right? And so having that balance of views actually was quite helpful, because it allowed us to reach a set of conclusions that I think are quite balanced in terms of being quite critical about both government, but also the private sector in terms of progress made in the sector, but also reflecting more broadly and honestly, I think, in terms of where we see the opportunities going forward. The kind of some of the common themes that we identify about the fact that yes, there's been progress, but maybe your Black-owned SMME is still very much on the back foot in the sector. And then raising the important question about, are we comfortable with the positioning of that type of player in the sector, or is there more that we can do? And so that's kind of where we land up as well. A representative view that allows us to at least make an informed contribution to the debates. And so that's what we try to do. I hope we deliver.
Yeah, and just, I mean, you spoke to different sectors, to different role players, to different stakeholders. What's the general feel in the fishing industry? You're probably the best person to have this type of overview experience of what's the general feel from them with the fishing industry currently.
Yeah, so I think we were well placed because we're coming into some degree from outside, if you will. So we have no fishing industry interests. Both of us were doing this work solely in our capacity as academics, right? So any other affiliations were not relevant at all. And we were essentially just asking very honest questions about what do you think has happened in the sector so far that's been progressive, and what should the future look like? And as I kind of started hinting at earlier, I think that there's a common sense that that there has been forms of progress along different measures. And of course, in the South African context, if there's anyone who doesn't really understand the context that's listening, is that there is a kind of BEE policy or Black economic policy framework, right, which sets out the rules in terms of nationally what are desirable outcomes on the transformation of, or the racial transformation of ownership, of management participation, or whatever it might be, right? And there used to be 7 criteria, there are now 5 key criteria. Now, ours was to then say, well, there's a common view also in the industry that you now have part of what was the desired outcome in 2005-06 when the rights were allocated, which is that you do have Black South Africans participating in the value chains of this particular fishery, right? Both in terms of the value chains of the major companies that own the largest proportion of rights, directly or through cluster arrangements, but also companies that have really made their own investments, hustled, I mean, and guys have gone through a lot, hustled to get finance, to invest in vessels and partner with other people to get some economies of scale for those vessels, and all of that, to a point where you actually have, and I want to be cautious here, you have pockets of emerging, potentially strong medium-sized firms, I think, in the long term, that could really contest in the sector and survive and actually organically compete for their role in the sector. And this is important in the South African context, and I think there was broad agreement around this because, and in the literature, I guess, is that at some point we did have to move the focus of Black economic empowerment policies away from a focus on ownership only to a broader conception, as we argue in the paper, of participation as also being a far more substantive thing. It's not about shareholding only. It's about, well, can Black-owned enterprises participate meaningfully? Can they own assets? First of all, buy assets, own assets, compete, access processing facilities, eventually grow even downstream in the sector as well, so that you have this kind of strong vertically integrated entrants or competitors in the sector, right? Or do you leave things as they are and have the same discussions as we're having now in 15 years' time? I think that's the real pressure, and that's why this moment is quite important in our society.
Yeah, no, 100%. So, I mean, if I just look at the table of contents, and I think some of the viewers, maybe they haven't seen it, I think the paper touches a bit. I'm just going to go through some of the contents that stand up. It touches on the background and the value chain. It touches on BEE in practice, fisheries quota allocations, the cluster agreement. It also competition and transformation in the egg industry, the MSC of South African Egg, which is the Marine Stewardship Council, and then also the overview of the FRAP process. And I mean, when I'm going to call you doctor. So doctor, when I read the paper, there's a sentence that is on the first page and there's a sentence that's on the last page. And the sentence is, as long inequality will be sustained as long as the rules protect incumbency. Why was that? Was that the current theme of the research paper? I mean, you start with it and you end with it. It was for me, it was like that standout sentence out of the whole paper, because that's basically what you're saying in the paper.
Yeah, I think that's spot on in terms of what we were trying to convey. And I think this speaks to, on the one hand, the kind of current state of the literature on inequality, on both in terms of wealth and income and access to resources, etc., but also speaks very pertinently to some of the very South African problems that we're hoping to contribute to through the assessment. I think the important point behind that statement, which is that you have a context in South Africa and in the sector where, of course, it doesn't lend itself to kind of widespread participation, because the economics of the sector is such that it's geared towards scale economies. You're probably going to end up with largely oligopolistic or concentrated structures, and that's part of the economics of the thing, right? And that's not what one can change. But that being said, the rules that you apply from a developing country perspective to shape the way in which markets evolve, right, is especially critical, right? So this moves away from a kind of binary view that says you either have, capitalism or socialism. The question is, what form of capitalism do you want to derive? And within that, at the level of sectors, how do you shape the rules so that you have one that recognizes both the important advantages of economic efficiencies, which is what the industry, I think, has argued very convincingly on, but also the fact that equity objectives and broader redistribution objectives, as we have in South Africa, are not necessarily opposed to efficiency objectives. And I wanted to make that very clear, because that's kind of an underlying principle of the paper. And so if you want to go a little bit further, what do we mean then by the rules of the game, right? And I think this also derives from work that we've done in this sector, but a range of other economic sectors, where in many ways what we say in terms of policy, so the goalposts, if you will, as the industry, one industry representative said to us, are set by government, right? And they are set through these interactions with different stakeholders, and ultimately government implements them. And so that tells you that there is some kind of important role in the types of rules that the state then sets in sectors like this, right? And so in many ways, if there's disappointment about some of the economic outcomes that we've seen in terms of transformation and social outcomes that we've seen in terms of transformation in the sector in the last 15 years, some of those, the blame has to lie with the rules that we set, the policies that we put out, right? It's easy to turn around and say, I think the issue is solely the responsibility of the unwillingness of industry to transform. But then I think our paper shows that actually there's a confluence of different factors here, including the way in which the government set its policy, but also critically, and this is where we come out quite strongly, the fact that there wasn't really monitoring and tracking of the outcomes of that, right? So in the context of the decimation of state capacity in this industry, or with respect to this industry, you then had no one checking whether the benefits that we wanted to achieve from the 2005-2006 allocation process were actually coming through, right? And so we're in a point now where there's a very strong narrative that says actually the benefits have been great. Just look at the numbers, and there isn't a government or other stakeholder voice that says, but we've done our own analysis and we've been tracking this for 15 years. And actually the outcomes have not been that great, or we need to be more nuanced about how we interpret them. And so I think this is also part of why we then went back to basics in terms of, well, let's go and talk to some of the small companies, right? Especially those, and I just want to make one final point on this question, especially those that have tried to participate as fishing industry participants in terms of the core business of the sector, right? So I think it's one thing to say the industry, or any industry really in the South African context, is transformed in terms of enterprise and supply development, where you're talking about the fact that corporate entities have included a lot of black-owned firms in providing cleaning services or transport services or fuel or other unrelated services or ancillary services with respect to the business of that sector. I think that's good and it's important, right? And there's been a lot of progress in that regard. in this industry and others. But we ask a much harder question, which is, yes, but what about your organic, medium, kind of large, small to medium black-owned enterprise that actually wants to participate not only in fishing, which is what we focused on in 2005 and 6, but also in processing and marketing and benefiting from the advantage that the MSC access provides in accessing export markets, right? And I think that's the kind of the more difficult question to answer. We argue in the paper that it's probably as good a time as any to try and answer that from a policy perspective as well.
Yeah, and I think what you just explained just touched on my next question, because I saw this term popping up throughout the paper, is the term political economy. What do you mean by the political economy? So one sentence just underlined it. In this paper, we apply a political economy approach to understand inequality and how to address it. What does it mean by political economy?
Sure. Look, I think the best way to express it is simply that when you're looking at any industry, it's important not to have a kind of binary view of how things work, right? So there isn't this world in which you have markets and this kind of these business agents that participate in it, and then on the other side of the scale you have the state and other groups, right? But really, to recognize that any agent in society, and this is not just a South African issue, this is anywhere, right? In any industry, you have economic agents that have what you would call socio-political or political interests. You have call it political elites and interests, or state actors that also have economic interests, right? And so there isn't this, there's politics and there's business. I don't think that's true. And you just have to just read the press, and you know that the industry is also playing politics. There's a lot of lobbying going on, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. That's how the world works, right? And so we take that approach, is to not have these lines that try and delineate between different actors, but to recognize that even business has very important interests in the way the sector plays out that are not just economic or profit interests. And similarly with the state, there are varied interests in it as well, right? And so that's the kind of thing that we try to explore in terms of the approach that we take.
Yeah, and also I saw, like, in some of your other papers as well, you also, of course, dealt with BEE in other sectors, not only the fishing industry, but is the fishing industry, does it have a unique type of BEE setup in comparison to the other sectors that you've done research on or done papers on, or is there a similar underlying theme throughout all the different sectors? Is there something different or special about the fishing industry?
Sure, that's a good one. I'm not entirely sure actually that there's something special. I think the economics of the sector is actually quite is certainly an important feature that doesn't necessarily apply in other industries, right? The fact that you have a natural resource that as a result of the economics of the sector, just other things equal, you will tend towards kind of high scale economy players. You'll have extensive vertical integration, etc. Right? And that you may not always find in other industries in which BEE policy is also applied. But I think there are also important commonalities if you think about the fact that the one thing about the sector is that it's a BEE sector in which there's also a very strong role for government in terms of regulation, in terms of who gets to participate and how, the terms of that participation, if you will. And you can think of other similar industries like mining, like liquid fuels and petroleum and all of that, where you've got some broadly similar features as well. Of course, those industries have taken a very charter-based or sector charter-based approach to deal with this, whereas here I think the policy framework still plays a very important role. But the threads are actually quite similar, I would say.
And you touched on the charter. Through your research, is there a reason why the fishing industry doesn't have a charter, or does not have guidance like in other sectors, like you touched on the mining and the petroleum liquid industry?
Yeah, I think there was a peculiar feature that I should say Stephano and I were not great experts on, and we struggled with as well, right? But what we did find is that the policy framework, however you view it, is quite pervasive in the sector. And so it's almost as if, whereas in the liquid fuel sector, you have the nice clean I think it's a good 3-page document that they have there, that is the liquid fuels charter, right?
Yeah.
That guides things there. Here you have a policy document that's actually a lot more expressive than the liquid fuels charter in terms of what it's trying to attain. So I would argue that it's probably better to have a more detailed policy document than a sector approach. To be honest with you, I mean, we've done parallel work, and I've got students looking at this as well. This charter approach, for example, in the liquid fuel sector, is not necessarily a success story in any event, right? So audits in I think it was a 2011 audit, show you that, while there was good handshakes and a very nice document about what needed to be done in the sector, arguably the outcomes across all measures, or at least most of them, were just not great, right? So it's more about, what kind of form of agreement needs to be reached in that sector to get the best outcomes? And I suppose the charters were better in others, and in this context, I think the policy is actually quite an important document.
Okay, perfect. So let's get into your paper. Of course, you touched on the deep-sea sector. You mentioned in the sector that we have 3 main role players in the sector, and how this relationship of those 3 main players in lack of a better word, control the deep-sea sector. And then you also just touch on how they structured the BBBEE deals, and also what the single economic units. Can we just give us some feedback on your research and your findings? Educate us a bit.
Awesome, I'd love to. So I think that, interestingly, a lot of what we find is not revolutionary, I would argue, but that's okay. I think that's sometimes the ability to repeat key messages and hopefully help to emphasize them on its own is an important contribution, right? Especially in a country where I think we are prone to not following through, certainly, on policy commitments and policy implementation. And so what the paper does is it basically starts at a point where we try to kind of speak to a wider audience by describing in some detail, but not too much, how the industry actually works, right? And this is primarily because we think that the economics of the industry, including who plays at which level, what are the different activities, etc., has very important implications for understanding how the policy then was shaped, but also some of the issues that we pick up from stakeholders through the interviews, right? And so what we do is we contextualize the structure of the sector also within a wider literature on things like global value chains, but also on competition law and economics as well, right? And making sure that it's clear that there's boundaries to which different policies can act to address certain issues. So, for instance, on competition law, there's a big frustration about why didn't the Competition Commission fix the sector? And one might argue that this is not the type of economic sector where the Commission could have gone beyond the remit of the competition law, right? It's written in plain vanilla, and so maybe another set of policies needed to come in to work hand in hand with that legislation and with BEE. So then we went out there and we actually spoke to, as I said, different stakeholders at different levels of the value chain. And in particular, there's a section of the paper where we go into a little bit more detail on what did the SMMEs, and I don't want to say, we were interested in very micro enterprises here, but let's call them SMMEs for this purpose. What did the SMMEs experience in the last 15 years, right? And this is quite important because I don't think their voice is present in the current debates. There haven't been studies on these issues. No one's gone back and asked, well, are you guys surviving? What do you need? Do you need funding? Whatever it might be. And so we thought that is at least an important contribution of our paper. Now, where does that land us up, right? Or where do we land up on that? We took those views and we then also tested them with private sector players, with large companies, small companies, government, and just other people that are knowledgeable on the sector. And we come up with what I think are maybe 4 or 5 big themes, right? Some of which I've mentioned before. I think there's a common theme. The first is probably that there actually has been progress in terms of the scorecards, right? So if you look at the fact that the sector went from 30-something odd % of Black ownership, and I forget the exact dates now, but this was like early 2000s, to something like 65% representative. And this is taken from the industry, the SATSIA study that was done as well, right? And the empowerment ratings. And the industry is very clear, and I think they're correct in saying, look, something has happened. There has been change with respect to these measures, right? You set the rules and we complied with them. And that puts pressure then on government. And this is where we come with our second point, which is to say, in recognizing the progress made, it still doesn't necessarily mean that one must accept that the status quo or the current environment is necessarily the best socio-economic outcome in terms of the balance of interests. And I think the very real potential for outsiders being progressively more excluded from the sector if the rules, if the sector doesn't go further from where it has reached in terms of more inclusion and more Black participation, right? And so we emphasize that the benchmark shouldn't only be were the scorecards achieved in and of themselves, right? And companies pass that exam. It's not the issue. The issue is what type of sector you're trying to define. Do you want one that's dynamic, where you have fringe players that compete in processing or compete with the big companies on fishing and ownership of vessels, so that there's always that rivalry and that incentive to invest and to keep getting better and better? Or do you want the status quo, right? The status quo is that you have a very stable sector, good export revenues, etc. But I don't know if that's necessarily a dynamic sector in which the benefits of the structure that's been allowed for the major companies necessarily even pass through to consumers, right? So you might maintain current jobs, but are you creating more over the long term? And I'm talking about 10, 15 years time. What type of conversation do we want to have? I would argue that we don't want the industry to still look like how it does. There's a few things that could get better. And I'll just run through the other 2 big points I think that came out. I think your SMMEs are quite clear that, yes, the world is different, but we, in many different ways, are still quite marginalized. And I think this is the big bang that if I say nothing else today, is quite important. There hasn't been sufficient support in various ways for your smaller operators to be able to really become significant players here. This starts at the level of the fact that the allocated quota shares are, of course, just not enough for many of them to even be viable. You cannot run a vessel on 200 TAC, right? It's not going to fly. Nor can you then take all 200 TAC players and try and bring them together into a consortium. It's an unmanageable thing. And so maybe that was a necessary step in the first phase, this first 15 years of BEE in the sector, so that you start to see what inclusion could look like, right? So it's not to blame government for the approach that was taken. But then now is probably a good time to say, right, we've learned a few lessons, one of which is that the scale economies issue does matter. And so maybe now's an opportunity to lend real support to those that have made the investments, medium-sized firms that have real potential to kick on from here and become real rivals in the sector, right? And that's a big point that we try to raise. But then we also argue, and I'll just pause after this point, Miles, is that to do that is not going to come down only to BEE policy. I think there's a risk in South Africa that we've overloaded or overburdened that policy in terms of what it should do versus what it can do. We argue that there's an important role to be played, if not an even more important role to be played, by your industrial policy strategy, which includes, is there development finance available for these guys to actually kick on? The guys, the smaller firms I'm talking about earlier. What role can market inquiries or other kind of pursuits by the competition agencies play in the sector to also help to unlock what we call strategic barriers to entry in the sector, because there still are very important strategic barriers to entry. And then also, well, also a broader role in terms of the policy and the department, in terms of watching more closely how the sector evolves, right? Which I don't think has been the case in the last 15 years, and creating these opportunities in a very adaptive and developmental way. There's no point waiting 15 years again after this point to look back and say, we got it wrong. Perhaps there needs to be more flexibility and adaptability in the policy framework so that you can react and change things and keep things going and test and learn as you go along. I think that's where you get good developmental outcomes, where the state is deeply involved in playing the game, not to shape it in its own interests, but to keep creating those opportunities and to recognize where some things are not working and making the rule changes that are required to make them work, right? In collaboration with stakeholders. I think that's probably where I want to leave that in terms of what the paper says, I guess.
Yeah, and I think you're spot on. I think if you say, and I like that view, that if you say, let's look at the past 15 years, it was something we needed to do for the small SMME. So now we know what it's all about. So in the next 15 years, we need to see how we can grow them to become a big role player, which is actually a very, it's actually a very good view. And I wanted to ask you as well, from your paper, what is your view? Because I see you touched on it a bit, and I think it's part of some of your interviews. Is what is your view of the big companies saying, if you take away quota, we're going to lose jobs? And of course, it has a ripple effect. Similarly with the small SMME. So you take the small SMME and you take quota away, they're going to lose jobs. But how do you, just from your research, how do you just put that balance in place so that everybody wins? But I think in FRAP, it's also impossible that everybody wins. Someone's going to have to lose, but you have to decide who's going to be the biggest loser.
Yeah, and isn't that the case in any policy area, right? And with any policy initiative, I mean, we could be talking about climate change or employment equity or anything. Someone's going to lose out. I should mention on this point, Miles, that I think there were some very interesting, surprising views from surprising quarters in the industry, where there was an admission that if there was a clear policy direction to support the growth of a lot of Black-owned firms that have really built something in the sector and given themselves a chance, right? And if doing so meant that you might actually even have to reduce quota for some of your larger players or in some agreed proportion, or whatever it might be, there might be buy-in to that type of discussion.
Nice.
And I'm saying that because I don't think what we learned or surprised us is that we're not talking about a kind of either-or world here. And this is making point about a binary world, right? Actually, there is, I think, general recognition that for the stability of the sector and for this thing not to blow up in a bad way, there's going to have to be trade-offs on different sides, right? And I would argue that that's the debate we should be having. And so even on the issue of jobs and that as well, certainly in our other research, we're also starting to show that, and even in this paper, you are able to show that although it's at a different scale, medium-sized challenger firms, and I'm talking about outsiders or firms that start to compete against the big guys in whatever industry, are starting to contribute on various grounds and not only jobs. So they are adding jobs. They also often have to be, because they're competing against such big firms, they actually have to be quite innovative in the way they do it. So they structure business models differently, which are more efficient ways as opposed to often very large, old school ways of doing things in some of the big companies, right? And when you're looking at whether you're going to have a dynamic industry that will grow the country in the long term, you want that interaction. You want new players to bring new ways of thinking in that as well. And so the idea that trading of quota necessarily means that you will lose efficiencies in the sector, I think needs to be weighted against what type of economic dynamism you want to see in the long term. And I want to argue here, and this is what we try to say in the paper, that actually it's not just about that trade-off of jobs. It's really about recognizing that these guys can add value, right? In economic terms as well, right? And it's not enough to simply argue that this is a scale economist industry, and so you can't do anything with quotas. Know that some companies lost out significantly in the 2005 process. And I think it took Sea Harvest, for instance, just looking at the data, a long time to recover, to rebuild and kind of get back on the track. That's well recognized, right? But I think without some of that disruption, you wouldn't have what is now claimed by the industry, rightfully so, I think, to have been quite a bit of good progress on transformation. So if no one tried to rattle the cages in the 2000s, they wouldn't be able to say in the annual reports, we really have done our best and we're doing well here. We've got new BEE partners that are now buying businesses off us and thriving, etc. You know, that would not happen, right? And so sometimes you do have to make some trade-offs, and sometimes I think there'll be a discomfort in that process. That's what I think we're discussing is who needs to concede what and what are the sacrifices that we made.
Yeah, and I mean, you touched on the economy. I mean, the sector that might just blow up. There's one sentence that intrigued me in the policy. It's when you discuss the FLAP application process, and you said, according to one of our sources, once the previous right allocation process ended, the regulatory capability of the institution in charge, which is DAF, essentially imploded. What does that, I mean, that's a massive sentence. What does that mean?
And, you know, we deliberately put that as a quote from people we spoke to because on its own, it captures an industry insider's sense of what's going on. Right? So we realize that we're not experts on this sector, and I think that's important to remember. But there are people that are, and that was a nice way of capturing the issue. Right? And I think it spoke to something we've seen in various other economic sectors as well. And it's important to remember here is that there's still a very, you know, once you've set the policy framework or agenda, there's still a very important role for the state and its implementing agencies to play in making sure that the intended outcomes actually get delivered. Right? So there'll be a lot of handshakes from Prep 21, a lot of agreements with industry. Okay, fine, we'll let you win on this one, but you're going to have to work with us on this, etc. You're going to have to commit to certain targets. I'm sure there'll be good trade-offs. But do those outcomes get, are there conditionalities against which you can hold firms accountable? Because that's actually often at the heart of industrial policies or interventions that actually work. It's where you have backstops to say, you guys, we committed to these targets together, and this is what we're going to do if you don't meet them. I think that's an important source of discipline that's been missing in this sector. And unfortunately, that comes from a range of different, range of different aspects. It comes from the rearrangement of the ministry at different points in time, various reshuffles, internal capacity issues. I think there was some freezing of employment of new people at some point, if I'm not mistaken. All of those things added up to a fact that we're now at a FRAP process where the government actually hasn't been able to, and in their defense, there just hasn't been the capacity, it seems, to actually look at what's actually happening on a socio-economic basis since we did this thing in 2005 and 6. Right? And so what that does when you have a vacuum of ideas in that way is that you then have other stakeholders, and the industry is doing this quite well, and I think they're within their rights to start to fill the void in terms of information. Right? And they start to fill the voids in terms of the fact and figures. And unfortunately, that's currently where we're at now, is that there aren't these different views in the industry about what's been happening.
Yeah. And then the next one, Doctor, you also touch on, I think it's 2 or 3 mergers and acquisitions in the fishing industry. And I just wanted to get your view. I think in the paper, you express the opinion that it didn't really add too much value in terms of the transformation of the sector, but more control. But I might be wrong. Can you maybe just elaborate a bit on those findings?
This is with respect to the mergers that have taken place.
Yeah. So the 3, I think it was 3 big ones.
Yeah, so I think on the big transactions, the big BE deals that have taken place, I don't think it would be, and I hope we don't say that, otherwise we have to sort it out. It's not entirely complete to say that there hasn't been gains from the transactions. I mean, even ownership transfers, and I think there's authors that are very prominent on BE issues, one of which comes to mind is someone called Dumatlubule, who comments that of course you had to have ownership transfers. Of course it's almost a natural outcome, in fact, and I think Roger Southall argues this as well. It's almost a natural outcome that you did have some people getting particularly wealthy in the process of BEE, right? But taken in context, the real question is, why weren't there more? That's actually what we should be debating. But if you think about the BBBEE debates in South Africa, they've completely been taken over by the media and broader ad narratives around the fact that 6 or 7 guys or 10 guys got rich, right? And I'm not trying to open up an unnecessary debate on those issues. Guys did get rich. It's not the point. Then the BEE policy and the kind of landscape evolved into this deal-making world, right? Where companies were ceding aspects of ownership, but also aspects of participation in their value chains to BEE partners. But I think the evidence is starting to really show that whilst the deals were very good in terms of access to ownership aspects of participation, a lot of the guys are saying, and this is not always the case, right? And so to be honest, even in this sector, it wasn't the generic view. But some guys are saying, yeah, we're partners here, but we actually don't benefit from the profitability and the gains of being owners in these companies. We certainly don't participate in decision making. And so what's the meaning of our participation? Often, in fact, we're debt-ridden as a result of having done those deals, right? And so the net benefit is not so great. There are other studies that have argued otherwise by Intellidex and others about BEE generally. This is not the point. The point is that the substance of inclusion and the views that we got from particularly these types of businesses is that not all BEE deals have necessarily been comprehensively beneficial. They've been beneficial in certain respects. In any event, we try to say this is not the point. Actually, what you want to be thinking about is, can you have organic new participants? And I say that generically, not even just Black-owned, but obviously in South Africa, it's particularly important. That start to really grow on their own grounds and participate in the sector. That, for me, is like the pinnacle. Whether we're right on that or not is a different story. That's for the industry to debate, I guess.
Yeah, so we've got Dr. Vilakazi, we've got a question here. I'll just put it on at the bottom. So, Dwai just asks Dr. Vilakazi, based on your view on the MSC, of course, she read the report. Shouldn't government be responsible body for the MSC certification on behalf of the SA fishing industry? I'm not sure if you have a view on that.
Yeah, I won't say too much. I mean, I would argue that there has been real value in the industry as a whole taking on the task of getting the certification. I think there's common, at least what we've seen in terms of the figures, there's real benefits in terms of being able to access the international markets, and that there's obviously a lot of debates about whether the kind of MSC thing is a big global conspiracy or general agency similar to that in different industries. This is not the point that we try to make. It's just that there is real value in that. The question I think we should be asking is whether that value translates across the board through the value chain and to a range of different stakeholders in the sector, right? Does it really translate if the firms you seek to support through your BEE policy only are participating, for instance, at the fishing level of the market? Possibly not. Our interviews suggest that a lot of guys don't feel like they even have a chance to argue or negotiate in terms of the terms that they get for the fish that they catch, right?
Yeah.
It's like that. And so it suggests to us that maybe the benefits of what is actually a very important certification, it seems, in the industry, don't necessarily pass through as best as they could through the entire value chain and through to all the players that participate in the sector, right? I would look at it just on the outside and suggest that those firms that have marketing activities, etc., are probably the ones that would benefit more from those activities. But I think I'll leave that one also to industry experts.
Yeah, of course.
The state is a different story in the context of the capacity issues as well. And I think the industry, certainly on various other grounds, has had to play the role of the state insofar as it's had to come in and do the types of certifications that are necessary, the type of environmental standards meeting that's happened as well. If they hadn't done that, one would argue that perhaps the state wasn't in a place to have done that itself, right? And who's to blame for that? They had to step in and do some of that. That's the sense that we got from our interviews.
Yeah, yeah, and I think more is MSc has more got to do with sustainability and responsible fishing. I mean, to make sure that there's fish for the next generations. Another point, I think we're moving into the last 10 minutes. I don't want to keep you too long. I know you're a busy man.
Sure.
But there was one section in the report, in your paper, also regarding the relationship between the Department of Fisheries and COPCOM in terms of mergers and acquisitions. I think there was a extract in the paper that said that the two have an agreement, but somehow there's not really, you're not meeting the minds in terms of these acquisitions, where the department are agreeing that they want one economic unit, and the COPCOM feels that that also is a barrier of entry, and it also limits rivalry in the fishing industry. Can you just speak on that, just your findings on that?
Sure. Yeah, that was a tricky or an interesting interaction that we found there. And there's a few, I mean, the Commission has obviously had to deal with a few different issues to do with fishing generally, so not just hake deep sea. In fact, I mean, I think there was some of the issues around collusion in pelagics and the Glenrick and all these different things that have gone on. And the sense that we got from the information that's publicly available is that obviously there was only so far that you can push a broader inclusion or participation agenda in the context of a merger case or a cartel investigation, right? And I think that's always going to be the case with the competition laws, is that they're necessarily bound not to go beyond what that legislation allows for. What's interesting, though, which I think is also quite timely if you think about it, is that the competition laws have also been broadened in terms of their, call it the ambit, a little bit most recently through amendments in 2019, because they've emphasized a lot more this issue of inclusion and participation, right? And so there's a direction that's heading in that way in terms of how do we use this law to achieve more than just to regulate mergers and kind of pass things through. But maybe we can also look after the broader national objectives of SMME and HD, historically disadvantaged person inclusion, etc. Now, how we treat that issue in the paper is simply to say, you have this kind of on-paper cooperation between the ministry and the competition agencies. But in many ways, some of the things that need to get done fall between them, right? There's almost a policy gap, if you will, which could be and should probably be filled also alongside organizations or entities such as the DTI. Because some of the issues that are missing are industrial policy issues. Where's the development finance? Can we change some of the industry rules and terms in favor of broader participation, etc.? Currently, it seems those issues aren't really catered for comprehensively in the policy landscape, and that's kind of what we try to highlight in the paper. We stop short of suggesting how it could be done, but we suggested as a principle that's an important policy gap that might be thought of in this time.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, and I mean the timing is perfect. I'm on your conclusion, chapter 6. Yeah. So I mean, doctor. So we at the front door of FRAP 2020. We're just waiting for the minister to open the door so we can see what's this all about. Of course, you've been engaged in this whole research. In your view, and based on the research, what would you like to see in the FRAP policies that are to be released? That's one. What would you like to see a significant change in the current regime in terms of policy that will be released? Of course, you looked at the 2005 6 as part of your research, and you of course identified some of the gaps. Yeah, and then just how do you see the policies accommodating all your findings and all that would be the best interest of the fishing industry?
Yo, that's a it's a tough one, because I think there's so many of the issues that are kind of hotly contested with good arguments on all the different sides, right? I think maybe just to start with some two important points that I think we try to introduce, which is that we think that there's a very important engagement that's missing, that needs to happen on the issue of considering the value chain as a whole. So to say it more clearly, we think there should be more engagement with the full value chain and dynamics at all the different levels, right? So I think one might argue that we necessarily had to, as a society, focus on fishing rights in the first phase. But from the broader policy landscape perspective, and I don't know if it's just a FRAP issue, there needs to be more detailed engagement and policy direction on what we want to see at the other levels of this value chain. It may be that we go through the exercise and find that, no, actually, South Africa is perfectly happy with transformation only taking place at the fishing level, but we would argue that you at least have to have the engagements on those issues to be able to make a conclusion. We cannot assume that changing fishing is going to change the whole landscape. It just doesn't. We know it hasn't. It's had 15 years to try and do that, and it hasn't happened. Actually, 20 years, arguably, right? So that's the one point. I think the other point is there's an important gap in the policy landscape generally that needs to be thought of, right? So I don't want to speak only on FRAP. I don't think necessarily that we were experts on that, but about how to crowd in wider forms of support for the firms that we're trying to grow, right? So if we're saying we have a real focus in the participation of Black-owned enterprises in this industry, and not just in Hake, but maybe in other parts, what are, in fact, the concrete measures that are in place, or the ones that are in place but that need to be augmented to make sure that you actually offer the types of deep support that these firms need to actually establish themselves and grow, right? And here I'm talking about also learning from other industries where just giving a company a once-off injection of an industrial development loan and saying, right, now you're going to spend the next 5 years paying me back at very high interest rates, even from the government, is unhelpful. It takes a company 4 or 5 years, often with SME, to even figure out what they're doing and really get a footing in their industry. And so there's a question about whether there should be more patient forms of development finance in the sector. Are there other incentives and support measures that the ministry could help to crowd in to support these players? Otherwise, I think that we're not maybe being as serious as we say we are about the growth of these companies, because it's not just about access to a set of rights. It's just not. I think evidence is showing there's a lot more that needs to happen. And I maybe would make the point that, and making that support happen for these firms is not just about what can you take away from the existing players. I actually think there's some very important advantages and gains that can come to the overall subsector or industry from collaboration with the large players as well, right? They have abilities and reach that your small players will only achieve in 20, 30 years' time. So there's no point using that as the benchmark. The question is, how do you structure incentives of different players, including the large players in the sector, so that we're all collaborating towards inclusive outcomes, but also outcomes that are sustainable in terms of maintaining jobs and investment and current patterns in the industry. I think those are kind of big themes that I would throw into the pond, if you will, on these issues. On FRAP specifically, I think there are probably 1,000 better people to speak on that, to be honest.
Yeah, and I mean, you speak about those SMMEs, and I think just in your conclusion, you also touch on it. You say that a lot of these smaller firms have managed to make investments in vessels and have grown their businesses in spite of the significant barriers to expansion. And I mean, that's exactly what you just said. It's even though they have got limitations, I mean, they're still growing. They're employing people. They are growing their businesses.
And it's a fairness thing, right? It's not so we're not arguing that there must be this kind of charity state, right? That's not the debate. The issue is the playing field necessarily level, so that those that have the kind of the guile, the experience, etc., can give themselves a chance to participate, or can have the chance to participate meaningfully, right? And where there are gaps, and I would argue that there are many, where there are certain disadvantages that are faced by these types of firms. And we talk a lot about the medium-sized firm, because we think there's a kind of magic about a medium-sized firm, right? Are there corrective measures to address that? And to give you a simple example, if there's an issue about certain abuses of buyer power or bargaining power by large players at different levels of the value chain, I'm not just talking about the listed company, I'm just saying if there is an argument like that in the sector, then can we use different types of interventions, including inquiries at the Competition Commission level, to explore those issues, identify how they work and why they're causing a problem, and solve them so that these guys can keep growing, right? That's kind of the way I think we need to be thinking about our approach to this sector. And a much closer engagement by policymakers and technicians, I guess, in this, including people like yourself. I mean, people that know about this industry and know a cross-section of subsectors about how smaller firms and different applicants to FRAP and whatever experience the industry. Those views need to come into the policy-making process, right? And we got the sense that there wasn't this central organizing voice for outsiders, and that's a big problem, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm a big champion of this phase of FRAP, because in the next 2 months we're gonna have draft policies out, we're gonna have draft applications out, we're gonna have everything draft. And I mean, I'm a champion of stakeholders. This is your opportunity to write comments, to submit comments. I mean, sometimes the department won't take into account, but sometimes they do. And that's when you have to challenge. If you're not agreeing with certain things, you have a 2-month period to comment and challenge the status quo, and don't cry afterwards if you didn't say anything.
Absolutely, especially, well, I suppose the footnote is that hopefully the process is fair, right? So that everyone's views, and we have to assume that it will be.
No, I mean, 100%. I mean, the minister, Barbara Creasy, said in the beginning that she wants us a real transparent FRAP and a real fair FRAP. So, I mean, the proof is in the pudding. We'll see once it commences whether everything is as it is. Dr. Thando Vilakazi, there are just 2 questions here before we go, but I don't think it's very applicable to our discussion. It's just, dear doctor, what are your thoughts with regards to the possibility of a rollover for rights due to COVID? I mean, if you can't answer it, I can answer it.
I think you should go for it. I'd be lying if I to
that. Ms. Fernandez, so the rollover of rights has to be approved by Parliament. I mean, they all expire at the end of this year. So the minister has to make an application to Parliament, and they have to amend the law. So that can only happen once Parliament has approved it. That's the one. And then the other one is, has the department issued the draft policies today? I cannot seem to find information regarding this. Dr. Vilakazi, if you can't answer it, I will answer it for you.
Go for it.
Okay. Just before the interview, I looked, and if there was anything, so nothing yet. There's still 3 hours left of the 12th of October, so we'll see what happens. But thanks, Imran. Dr. Thando Vilakazi, thank you so much. I think I firstly have to say, the paper, if you want to find out more about the fishing industry, especially I read the paper, I think your paper and your research would add so much value, and I hope it will spur on the conversation regarding what is in your paper, and would like to see it in the policies. And it's really valuable research at the perfect time from a independent, not interested in fishing party, which is the ideal type of research that you want. But from my side, because I love the fishing industry and I love data, I really love the research. Thank you so much. And I also just want to thank you so much for your hour of conversation. I know medical doctors charge consultation per hour. I don't know what you're going to charge me. But thank you so much for your time. I really learned a lot. I appreciate the paper. And yeah, any parting thoughts from you?
Look, no, I mean, I don't think there's much else to say. Thank you for this platform. I think it's a particularly useful conversation to be had right now. And hopefully there's more on this, because the more debate and engagement there is on these issues, and particularly FRAP, I think the better the outcomes will be, right? And maybe just to say, I think we've looked at a range of barriers to entry type issues that cut across industries, not just fishing in that as well. And so I'm just welcoming your your listeners to also check out our website, which is www.competition.org.za. At University of Johannesburg, and I mean, you'll see a range of our different papers on these types of issues, SMME issues, Black industrialist issues, and a range of other things, and hopefully engage with us on that as well. Thank you.
Yeah. So, and Doctor, so what are you currently working on? I mean, what other sector are you busy deep diving into?
Interestingly, I'm doing a hell of a lot of work on BEE right now. I'm looking at other aspects of it as well. Our hope is that work could come out in the next kind of 6 months to a year. But our organization is then also constantly looking at issues to do with, for instance, supermarket and grocery retail value chains, and also various issues to do with linking South Africa to Southern Africa, right? In a time like COVID, where a lot of the growth and opportunity actually lies within the continent, rather than in other international markets potentially. And so that's the type of work that we do as well. How do we build South African industries towards those positive outcomes in the long term? And that work is also on our website. And obviously and the work is free. I mean, we're a university-based institution, so people that want to look up the website, look up the papers, download them, share them, whatever. This is precisely why we exist as a center. Awesome.
So yeah, I'll include the link. Maybe you must just WhatsApp me the link of all the papers, and I can just include it when I share this interview. But once again, thank you so much for your time. Really, really appreciate it. I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation and learned a lot. And yeah, you keep well and keep safe.
Awesome. Likewise. Thanks.
Thanks, Bye-bye. Bye.